Yeah, yeah, and it's wonderful. Thank you for those thoughts and this. Yeah, and and as a Lutheran myself, I'm happy that you are quoting Luther a lot here. And maybe one more question about that, because Lutheran theology does not like operate so much with the covenant theology, although we do not see it as something. We're not dispensationalists.
Yeah.
So we sort of like in between, because we see the value of covenants, but we don't add on it in the same way as Baptists do. But you said you had
Well, different
something before we
Baptists. There
start.
are some Baptists who are dispensationalists. There are some Baptists who
Mm,
hold to a more reformed understanding of covenants. And there are also some Baptists, especially at our institution, who hold to, I would say, kind of a via media as well, which is called progressive covenantalism, which tries to take seriously the biblical covenants in that we reserve the covenant language, the word berit in Hebrew and the word yathiki in Greek, for
mhm,
the biblical covenants themselves. And I think at least, although Reformed theology, this can get into a more complicated discussion. Reformed theology, of
mm,
course, has theological covenants, covenant of grace, covenant of works, which might be useful categories. At the very least, I would say we don't want to confuse the terminology by taking the word covenant, which is used in a biblical context, biblical language, and then using it for a second idea, different idea, namely a theological covenant. So,
mm,
we can discuss and debate the role of the theological covenants, but I think we want to emphasize the primacy of the biblical covenants and relate them to
mm.
one to another. That's an ongoing debate in evangelical scholarship. I
Yeah,
don't myself fall into the dispensational camp, but I think that a proper appreciation of the progression of the covenants. That's why progressive covenantalism gets its name.
yeah,
It's the idea that the covenants progress and build upon one another as until we get to the new covenant, which is then the ultimate one that is still in force today.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Maybe for the viewer that might not be super strong on, um, or listener who's not super strong on what a covenant is, could you sort of like quickly
Yeah.
define it?
Well, there are various kinds of covenants we can think about in Scripture. There are, for example, covenants between two human parties or between nations.
Mm,
And we aren't usually talking about those when we think about biblical covenants or the major biblical covenants. We're talking about arrangements between God and his people, whether the Old Testament
mm,
Israel or the New Covenant community of believers, the church. These are special arrangements which God makes sovereignly with his people. And an analogy from the ancient Near East that has been used to help us understand this is the idea of a suzerain vassal treaty, where a more strong political power, the suzerain, makes a treaty with a vassal, a smaller, lesser power. But this doesn't fully
mm,
capture what's going on here behind these biblical covenants, because basically what they are is a gracious arrangement where God condescends to offer to his people certain things, and also sometimes in some cases make demands of them. And so these arrangements, I believe, are the backbone
mm,
in a sense of Scripture. They structure the biblical narrative from creation, fall, and redemption all throughout
mm.
the whole Bible.
Yeah, yeah. That's helpful. For example, when we go, I'll just give an example. Noah has a covenant with God
Yeah,
after the flood, but
yeah,
that's as a covenant where he actually cannot really obey it. It's God that says, "I'm doing it for you,"
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
Right. The terminology of conditional versus unconditional covenants is sometimes used, and people will
mm,
sometimes classify the covenants according to whether they are conditional or unconditional. I think that can be helpful in many ways, but
hmm,
even in the case of something like the Abrahamic covenant, which is usually viewed as an unconditional covenant, we do have reference to Abraham being faithful and fulfilling the covenant. Now, I would say theologically that God enabled him to do that. That God took him to Canaan. God um, ultimately regenerated him. God made him a believer.
mm,
God counted his faith as righteousness. Yet there was, in a sense, that condition that he was to be faithful and he was to circumcise his household members in keeping that covenant. So if we aren't careful, the conditional versus unconditional classification can be a little bit too wooden, but I still think it is a helpful way of thinking about the covenants. I would say, for example, that the Mosaic covenant is quite clearly a conditional covenant, that if God's people were to break the terms of that covenant, there are many curses outlined in this covenant, in the ceremony, in both in Deuteronomy and also in Leviticus, which would give punishments, certain punishments for the breaking of that covenant.
Yeah, and then it becomes very gracious because they break that covenant in many ways.
Over and over again, and God's patience with them, stretching out centuries. We find out, for example, that in the days of King Josiah, in the last days of Judah, they discover the Book of the Covenant, a reference to Book of the Law, rather, a reference to Deuteronomy, and it turns out that they had been neglecting the covenant for centuries. They'd been neglecting the Passover, apparently, for centuries, and God had been gracious and kind to them, yet laying his judgment over them. So we see a very long-suffering God dealing with his people Israel.
Yeah, that's amazing, because Josiah, I can't remember the exact time, is around, because it's after the fall of the Northern Kingdom as well.
Yeah. 7th century,
Yeah.
BC.
So it's still quite far from Moses.
Oh yeah, many centuries. Yeah. In the last
It
decades.
Yeah, exactly. So it also shows, like, this history of Israel shows how kind God is in his grace towards this, like, completely unfaithful people.
Yes, and another example I might add here is that God's patience towards Israel can also be matched by God's patience to the other nations. When we think about Abraham being promised a land, and when he falls into that deep sleep, and the Lord shows him a vision of his people, his descendants being slaves in Egypt, he says it will be some time, many centuries, before they come and take possession of the land of Canaan, because, as he explains, the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet been fulfilled. So just think about that. In God's timing and his providence, he's allowing centuries of evil, things like child sacrifice and murder and horrible sexual sin, to go on in Canaan before he finally uses Israel as a means of judgment against those nations and drives them out. So God is kind and long-suffering to not just Israel, but also the surrounding nations. And that means that Israel was in a foreign land for much longer time period than we might humanly expect and think.
Yeah, it's quite wild to think about when we sort of dive into the intricacies of all these things. Thank you for watching this clip. If you enjoyed it, you can find another one by clicking just over here. Or if you want to watch the full episode and dive a step deeper, you can find a link in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.